If they think a $900 million deal is decided by charm alone, they have never sat across from Victoria Carter, because silence like hers doesn't negotiate, it decides. The conference room at Whitmore Capital overlooked downtown Manhattan, glass walls reflecting a skyline that looked as confident as the people inside it. Or at least that was the illusion they preferred. Victoria Carter arrived without ceremony. No entourage, no branded briefcase, just a navy blazer, a leather portfolio, and the kind of calm that made assistants lower their voices without knowing why. At the far end of the table, Richard Whitmore didn't stand to greet her. He simply studied her like an equation he was certain he had already solved. Jason Whitmore leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against a $900 million term sheet, as if patience was something he could afford more than respect. Elizabeth Whitmore offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes, the kind of smile reserved for people she believed were temporary in permanent rooms. Maya Collins, seated near the legal display panel, noticed something unusual in the approval ledger. Victoria Carter's authority tag was highlighted in green while no one addressed it. Victoria said nothing yet, her silence filling the room in a way that made conversation feel slightly unsteady, like everyone was speaking louder than necessary to compensate. "You don't need to lead this negotiation," Jason said under his breath. "We already know how this ends." Victoria finally opened her portfolio, not rushed, not reactive, just precise, as if every page had already been read in a different timeline. The room didn't realize it yet, but the negotiation had already shifted from discussion to evaluation, and Victoria Carter had stopped participating as a guest. Across the table, Daniel Brooks quietly reviewed the contract flags, his expression tightening as he recognized clauses that could be triggered without consensus if authority verification was confirmed. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room with practiced confidence that usually worked on investors who didn't ask questions. Victoria looked up at him then, not challenged, but assessing, like she was deciding which version of this conversation would survive the next 5 minutes. Maya Collins suddenly understood the imbalance was not about presence, but about assumption. An assumption was always the most expensive mistake in rooms like this. And as Richard finally gestured toward the contract table, unaware of how close they already were to losing everything, Victoria Carter quietly closed her portfolio. Something in the room shifted imperceptibly, not because anyone spoke louder, but because the authority that had been assumed was no longer stable. Victoria placed her portfolio down with quiet finality, and for the first time, Richard Whitmore noticed that she was no longer reacting to the deal at all. She was measuring it. Every clause, every assumption, every person at the table suddenly became part of a calculation they were not invited to see. The room continued to behave as if authority was still evenly distributed, but Victoria Carter had already stopped treating it that way. Jason Whitmore tilted his chair slightly, watching her with the impatience of someone who had never been corrected in a room he considered his own. He tapped the term sheet again, slower this time, as if rhythm could replace certainty. Victoria did not respond to him. Instead, her attention moved across the table with deliberate stillness, taking in every participant, every hesitation, every unspoken alignment. Richard Whitmore finally leaned forward and spoke again, his tone carefully controlled, attempting to re-establish dominance through familiarity rather than force. He referenced numbers, projected returns, and market positioning, but each sentence began to feel slightly misaligned, as if the audience he expected was no longer fully listening. Elizabeth Whitmore adjusted her posture, offering subtle interruptions disguised as clarification, each one designed to reposition Victoria as a contributor rather than a decision-maker. Maya Collins, seated near the digital display, noticed the internal approval system flicker again. Victoria Carter remained marked as final authorization authority, yet no one at the table acknowledged it. Daniel Brooks quietly opened the contract file on his tablet, scrolling slower than before as additional flags appeared, indicating conditional control clauses tied to a single signature tier that had not been discussed aloud. Jason leaned forward, breaking the flow of the conversation with a tone that carried an unnecessary layer of certainty, stating that leadership in negotiations required experience in their sector, a comment that hung in the air longer than intended. Victoria finally looked at him directly, not with confrontation, but with the calm observation of someone confirming a pattern they had already seen many times before. She asked a simple question about the revision history of the agreement, and the room briefly shifted as Daniel Brooks hesitated before answering, revealing that the last modification had been submitted under executive override access that required higher clearance than Richard Whitmore currently held. The sentence did not create immediate chaos, but it changed the temperature of the room in a way that was subtle and irreversible. Elizabeth glanced at Jason, then at Richard, as if silently recalculating assumptions that had been made before Victoria entered. Maya leaned closer to her screen, realizing that the approval structure did not simply include Victoria Carter, it defaulted to her. Jason attempted to regain control by reframing the discussion toward valuation projections, but his voice now carried less certainty and more performance. Victoria remained still, allowing the conversation to continue without interruption, which made the others speak faster, as if silence itself had become pressure. Daniel Brooks received a secure notification on his device, pausing mid-scroll, his expression tightening as he recognized that the compliance layer had begun initiating an independent audit sequence. Richard noticed the shift in Daniel's focus and asked what had changed, but Daniel did not answer immediately, still processing the escalation protocol being triggered in real time. Maya finally spoke, carefully, pointing out that the system was verifying authority alignment across all active stakeholders, and that one profile was now overriding standard review thresholds. No one asked who, because the answer was already visible on every screen, even if no one wanted to acknowledge it. Victoria Carter remained composed, her hands resting near the portfolio, not as a participant in uncertainty, but as someone watching others discover it too late. The negotiation had not yet broken, but the foundation beneath it was no longer stable, and every sentence spoken now sounded like it was moving closer to a conclusion no one at the table had been prepared to authorize. The shift in the room did not announce itself with noise. It arrived as a collective hesitation, as if every participant at the table had simultaneously realized they were no longer operating under the assumptions they entered with. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the compliance screen, his fingers hovering above the tablet without touching it, as the system continued to expand its verification scope beyond standard contract review. Richard Whitmore noticed the change in posture before he understood the cause. Daniel was no longer scrolling. He was waiting, and waiting in a room like this meant something else had taken control of the timeline. Jason Whitmore tried to speak again, but his voice lost some of its earlier confidence as he questioned whether procedural delays were normal in this stage of the negotiation, attempting to reframe uncertainty as routine rather than consequence. Victoria Carter remained unchanged, her attention still quiet, still measured, but now clearly no longer participating in the same version of the conversation as the others. Maya Collins leaned closer to her screen and quietly confirmed what she had been seeing. The approval hierarchy was no longer static. It was actively reorganizing around a single authority profile that none of them had formally acknowledged during the meeting. Elizabeth Whitmore shifted in her seat, her earlier composure replaced by a subtle tension as she realized the system was not reacting to discussion, it was reacting to identity validation. Daniel finally spoke, his voice careful, explaining that the compliance framework had initiated an independent audit lock due to conflicting authorization signals, meaning no contractual changes could proceed until verification was complete. The words created a pause that no one immediately filled, because it was not the explanation that mattered, it was what triggered it. Jason frowned and asked for clarification, insisting that no such escalation had been requested by their side, but Daniel hesitated before confirming that the trigger source was external to Whitmore Capital's submission chain. That detail changed how Richard looked at the table, his expression tightening as he began to understand that the negotiation was no longer fully within his operational control. Maya, still observing the system feed, noticed a secondary line of authority activation marked with full executive override clearance, and for the first time, she turned her attention directly toward Victoria Carter instead of the screen. Victoria did not acknowledge the attention. She simply opened her portfolio again, not to present new information, but to align with a process that was now unfolding without permission from anyone else in the room. Elizabeth finally spoke, asking if there was a mistake in the system, but Daniel responded carefully that the system did not register uncertainty once executive verification was engaged, it only executed. The air in the room felt heavier not because anything had been said aggressively, but because each explanation removed another layer of assumed control. Jason leaned forward again, attempting to challenge the legitimacy of the audit, but his words lost structure halfway through as Daniel raised his hand slightly, signaling that the system had already escalated to board-level visibility. Richard Whitmore looked directly at Victoria for the first time without preconception, as if trying to locate the point where the situation had stopped belonging to him. Victoria finally spoke, her voice even, not raised, not forced, simply precise, asking Daniel to confirm whether all stakeholders had been properly identified in the authorization chain. Daniel paused, then admitted that one stakeholder had been continuously flagged as unverified due to assumptions made during initial entry classification. That statement settled in the room like something irreversible, because it confirmed that the system had been operating on incomplete recognition from the beginning. Maya exhaled quietly as she realized the error was not procedural, it was perceptual, and perception was no longer enough to sustain control over what was happening next. Victoria Carter closed her portfolio again, and for the first time since the meeting began, the others understood that the negotiation had already ended, they had simply not been notified yet. The realization did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual collapse of certainty, spreading across the table like a quiet inversion of everything they believed they were controlling. Daniel Brooks remained focused on the compliance interface, where the system had now fully shifted into executive validation mode, displaying confirmation streams that no longer required input from Whitmore Capital to proceed. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting still on the table, a posture that suggested he was trying to regain influence through presence alone, but the room no longer responded to posture. Jason Whitmore finally stopped tapping the term sheet, his fingers resting for the first time as he watched Daniel's screen reflect authorization protocols expanding beyond the original contract scope. Elizabeth Whitmore looked toward Victoria Carter again, but this time her expression carried uncertainty rather than composure, as if she was trying to reconcile what she believed with what was now being verified in real time. Maya Collins quietly highlighted a system log entry, showing that the negotiation instance had been reclassified from active discussion to executive resolution review, a designation that removed all participant parity until confirmation was complete. Daniel cleared his throat carefully, explaining that the compliance engine was now cross-referencing identity authority across external financial governance layers, meaning the system was no longer asking for permission, it was confirming hierarchy. The phrase landed heavily because it implied the conversation itself was no longer the controlling environment. Jason attempted to respond, questioning how an external authority could override a live negotiation without prior disclosure, but Daniel interrupted gently, stating that disclosure was not required once executive-level authentication thresholds were met. That explanation changed the emotional temperature of the room again, not through intensity, but through clarity, because clarity removed ambiguity and replaced it with consequence. Richard Whitmore finally spoke, his tone lower now, asking Daniel to confirm whether Victoria Carter's authority profile had been fully validated within their internal records, and Daniel paused longer than before, reviewing multiple system feeds before answering that the profile had been continuously validated but historically deprioritized due to initial classification assumptions. That sentence created a visible shift in Richard's expression because it reframed everything that had happened since the beginning of the meeting as a misinterpretation rather than a negotiation. Elizabeth leaned slightly forward, asking what classification error could cause such a discrepancy, but Daniel replied that the system does not generate error in authority recognition. It only reflects the accuracy of input assumptions made during onboarding. Maya's eyes moved between the screen and Victoria Carter, understanding now that the system had never been uncertain about Victoria's position, only the people in the room had been. Victoria finally spoke again, not raising her voice, not accelerating her tone, simply asking Daniel to confirm whether the Whitmore transaction structure was still active under unrestricted review conditions. Daniel hesitated, then confirmed that the structure was now paused under executive directive pending final authority confirmation, which meant the deal itself was no longer progressing forward in any operational capacity. Jason exhaled sharply, as if trying to reset the reality of what he had just heard, but there was nothing to reset, because the system had already transitioned into enforcement state. Richard turned his head slightly toward Victoria, no longer with assumption, but with direct attention that carried the weight of recognition forming too late to be useful. Victoria closed her portfolio once more, and in doing so, the entire negotiation lost its remaining illusion of motion, because nothing in the room was still being decided by the people who thought they were in control. The silence that followed the system pause was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of consequence settling into place, where every assumption now required permission to continue existing. Daniel Brooks lowered his hand from the tablet, no longer interacting with the interface, because there was nothing left in it that required human adjustment, only confirmation states already locked by executive authority validation. Richard Whitmore finally broke his stillness, leaning forward with a controlled breath as if trying to reassert presence through proximity alone, asking Daniel in a measured tone whether the pause was procedural or reversible. But Daniel's response came slower now, explaining that the system had transitioned from review state to enforcement state, meaning no internal override could be applied without external authorization. Jason Whitmore shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by a quieter tension that revealed itself in small movements, his eyes moving between his father and the contract display as if searching for a version of events where control could be recovered through explanation. Elizabeth Whitmore finally spoke directly toward Victoria Carter, her tone attempting to restore social structure through politeness, asking whether this escalation was necessary for a negotiation of this scale. But Victoria did not respond immediately, allowing the question to exist without resolution long enough for its authority to weaken on its own. Maya Collins watched the compliance feed continue to update, now showing full executive confirmation active across all pending financial instruments tied to the Whitmore deal, each line item shifting from pending approval to suspended execution under a single consolidated authority profile. Daniel finally clarified, carefully choosing words that no longer carried negotiation framing, stating that the transaction could not proceed until the system received explicit continuation authorization from the verified executive stakeholder, and that no such authorization had been issued from Whitmore Capital's side. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in recalibration, as he began to understand that the structure of the deal had always contained a dependency they had not properly accounted for. Jason leaned forward again, asking if identity verification could be delayed or reviewed manually, but Daniel shook his head gently, explaining that manual review was no longer available once the audit lock had been triggered by executive-level reconciliation. The phrase executive-level reconciliation echoed differently in the room now, because it no longer sounded like process, it sounded like hierarchy being enforced in real time. Elizabeth turned slightly toward Richard, her confidence replaced by measured concern as she asked quietly what would happen if the verification remained unresolved, and Daniel answered with careful neutrality that unresolved verification results in indefinite suspension of all contract execution pathways. Maya's attention remained fixed on the system output, where Victoria Carter's authority designation had now expanded across multiple institutional layers, including financial compliance governance and contract enforcement override. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice steady and unchanged, asking Daniel to confirm whether the Whitmore team still wished to proceed under conditions of full transparency and active audit visibility, a question that reframed the entire meeting without raising its volume. Daniel did not answer immediately, because the system itself had already begun waiting for the response that would determine whether the negotiation continued or concluded. Richard Whitmore looked at Jason, then at Elizabeth, and for the first time there was no assumption of outcome in his expression, only recognition that outcome was no longer something they controlled. The room did not collapse, it simply stopped moving forward on their terms. And in that stillness Victoria Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, not waiting for approval, not requesting permission, only observing the moment when everyone else finally understood what she had already known. The room had entered a state where no one was speaking to change the outcome anymore. only to confirm how far the outcome had already progressed without them. Daniel Brooks stood slightly away from the table now, his attention divided between the compliance interface and the increasingly quiet reactions around him, as the system maintained its executive reconciliation lock without deviation or pause. Richard Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair, no longer attempting to project control, instead watching the negotiation like someone observing a structure that had already stopped responding to its foundation. Jason Whitmore opened his mouth once, then closed it again, realizing that every attempt to reframe the situation as procedural only made the procedural authority less relevant. Elizabeth Whitmore's expression had shifted into something more restrained, no longer composed confidence, but measured uncertainty, as she began to understand that the presence across from them was not being evaluated, it was evaluating them. Maya Collins remained focused on the system logs, which now showed full activation of audit transparency mode, meaning every clause, every assumption, and every prior approval pathway was being rechecked against executive authority standards that superseded internal hierarchy. Daniel finally spoke again, carefully explaining that the system had completed a full cross-validation against external governance records, and that the Whitmore transaction could no longer be processed under its current authorization structure without direct executive continuation approval. The words landed differently now because they no longer sounded like process language. They sounded like finality. Richard asked quietly what options remained, and Daniel paused before answering that the only remaining action path was executive directive submission from the verified authority holder present in the room. No one responded immediately because the implication was no longer abstract. Jason shifted in his seat, looking toward Victoria Carter for the first time without the assumption of superiority that had guided his earlier behavior, his expression now uncertain rather than dismissive. Elizabeth followed his gaze, and for the first time her politeness had no structure to stand on, only awareness that the structure itself had changed. Victoria remained still, her posture unchanged from the beginning of the meeting, but now that stillness carried a different weight, because the room was no longer interpreting her presence, it was reacting to it. Maya quietly noted that the system had begun generating a full compliance audit trail, logging every statement, every escalation, and every attempted override request from the Whitmore side, without requiring manual activation. Daniel confirmed this softly, stating that the audit was now irreversible and being mirrored to institutional oversight channels in real time. Richard finally asked, in a lower tone, whether the deal itself was still intact in any form, and Daniel answered carefully that the agreement existed only in suspended state pending executive resolution, meaning it could resume or dissolve entirely based on a single authorization decision. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was recognition that control had already transitioned. Jason looked down at the table, no longer tapping anything, no longer performing confidence, as the realization settled that the outcome they had been negotiating was no longer something they could influence through conversation. Elizabeth adjusted her posture once more, but it was not to regain composure. It was to accept the absence of it. Victoria Carter finally spoke, not to escalate, not to correct, but simply to acknowledge the state of the system, asking Daniel to confirm that all parties now understood the current authorization condition. Daniel nodded once, and in that confirmation the room collectively understood that the negotiation had already ended at the exact moment they stopped recognizing who was actually in control. The stillness in the room had reached a point where even small movements felt like they required permission, as if the atmosphere itself had been rewritten into something more formal, more final, and far less forgiving of assumptions. Daniel Brooks remained near the compliance interface, but he was no longer interacting with it, only observing as the system maintained its executive reconciliation state with complete autonomy. Richard Whitmore finally spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the certainty of ownership, only the cautious tone of someone trying to understand the boundaries of a space that had quietly changed shape around him. Jason Whitmore looked toward Victoria Carter with attention he had not displayed earlier, as if trying to reconcile her silence with the weight that silence now seemed to carry. Elizabeth Whitmore sat slightly forward, her hands resting closer to the table edge, her earlier confidence replaced by a controlled uncertainty that no longer had a script to rely on. Maya Collins continued monitoring the system feed, where the audit process had now expanded into full transactional history review, exposing every layer of authorization logic that had been assumed rather than verified during the initial negotiation entry. Daniel finally spoke in a measured tone, explaining that the system had completed a full executive hierarchy alignment check, confirming that all active controls on the agreement now defaulted to a single verified authority node. The words did not provoke reaction immediately, because the room had already begun to anticipate conclusions before they were spoken. Richard asked quietly what that meant for the Whitmore position in the deal, and Daniel responded carefully that their role had shifted from primary negotiator to conditional participant pending executive directive approval. Jason exhaled slowly, as if trying to release the tension building in his posture, but there was nowhere for it to go, because nothing in the system was responding to interpretation anymore. Elizabeth turned her gaze back to Victoria, this time without expectation of familiarity, only recognition that something fundamental about the structure of the meeting had been misunderstood from the beginning. Maya noticed a final update on the compliance feed, where the executive authority marker associated with Victoria Carter was now fully expanded across all operational layers of the contract environment, removing any ambiguity about decision ownership. Daniel confirmed this quietly, stating that the system was now awaiting final executive confirmation to either proceed or terminate all transaction pathways tied to the $900 million agreement. The number itself now felt less like a valuation and more like a threshold that had already been crossed in one direction. Richard leaned back slightly, his expression no longer focused on negotiation strategy, but on the realization that strategy had no remaining function in the current state of the system. Jason attempted to speak once more, but stopped mid-sentence as Daniel raised a hand slightly, indicating that no further procedural input from Whitmore Capital would alter the current execution status. Elizabeth finally asked, in a lower voice, whether the decision had already been made before the meeting began, and Daniel did not answer immediately, because the system itself had already begun confirming that all preparatory authorization conditions had been satisfied prior to their arrival. Victoria Carter finally moved for the first time in several minutes, not with urgency, not with reaction, but with the calm precision of someone concluding a process that others were still trying to understand. She looked across the table once, not to assert control, but to acknowledge the final state of alignment that the system had already reached without requiring persuasion. Daniel straightened slightly, confirming that executive directive status was now active, and that the agreement would proceed only under her final authorization input. In that moment, the room understood not through announcement, but through absence of alternatives, that the negotiation had never been between equals. It had always been waiting for recognition of authority that was already in place. The final confirmation did not arrive with drama or escalation. It arrived with the quiet precision of a system executing a decision that had already been validated across multiple authority layers, leaving no space for interpretation or negotiation. Daniel Brooks remained still for a moment as the executive directive interface activated fully, displaying a final authorization prompt that no longer required discussion, only acknowledgement of completion. Richard Whitmore watched the screen without speaking, his earlier attempts at control now replaced by a stillness that came from understanding there was nothing left to influence. Jason Whitmore leaned forward slightly, as if proximity to the table could restore access to outcomes that were already being removed from his control architecture. Elizabeth Whitmore looked between Daniel and Victoria Carter, her expression now fully stripped of certainty, replaced by the recognition that the structure they had depended on was no longer responsive to their position in it. Maya Collins observed the final audit sequence complete its reconciliation cycle, confirming full executive authority alignment across all contract layers, with all subordinate approvals automatically invalidated due to hierarchy correction. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady but formal, stating that the system was now requesting final executive action to resolve the status of the $900 million agreement, and that no further input from Whitmore Capital would be processed under the current state. The phrase "no further input" settled heavily in the room, because it marked the end of participation disguised as negotiation. Richard finally asked, quietly, whether there was any remaining pathway to preserve the agreement, and Daniel responded after a brief pause that all conditional pathways had been closed upon completion of executive verification. Jason exhaled slowly, no longer attempting to challenge the structure, only absorbing it. Elizabeth lowered her gaze slightly, as if recognizing that the conversation had never been about persuasion, but about recognition of authority that had existed before their arrival. Maya noted on her screen that the agreement status had transitioned from suspended to pending executive resolution, with full compliance audit attached and irreversible logging activated across institutional records. Daniel turned slightly toward Victoria Carter, confirming that her directive authority was now the only remaining variable capable of determining outcome state. The room did not react immediately, because reaction implied possibility, and possibility had already been removed from the system. Victoria Carter remained composed, her presence unchanged, but now fully aligned with the final operational structure that had been building across the entire sequence of validation. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply acknowledged the completion state of the process by placing her hand lightly on the portfolio in front of her, signaling readiness for final directive input. Daniel confirmed that the system was awaiting her decision, either to execute termination of the agreement or to authorize conditional continuation under revised governance terms. Richard Whitmore looked at her directly now, no longer with assumption, but with recognition that the decision had never been shared equally in authority, only in observation. Jason remained silent, his earlier confidence fully replaced by the understanding that the structure he believed he was participating in had already shifted beyond his reach. Elizabeth did not speak, as there was nothing left to clarify that would change the outcome state already prepared by the system. Maya Collins watched the final confirmation field blink steadily on the screen, waiting for a single authorization input to resolve $900 million of structured expectation into either continuation or closure. Victoria Carter finally spoke, her voice calm and final, issuing a directive that immediately propagated through the system architecture, and as she did, the interface responded instantly, executing full resolution protocol across all connected financial channels. Within seconds, the Whitmore Capital authorization layer collapsed into inactive status. The agreement terminated under executive directive, and all associated transaction pathways were formally closed, leaving only audit records and confirmation logs as evidence of what had once been considered a live negotiation. The room remained still as the system completed its final synchronization, and in that silence, it became clear that nothing had been taken away, only formally concluded by the one person who had never needed to negotiate for control in the first place. The moment the system confirmed full execution of the executive directive, the room did not react with celebration or protest, but with a stillness that felt heavier than any spoken response, as if reality itself had paused to register the finality of what had just occurred. Daniel Brooks slowly lowered his tablet, the compliance interface now locked into completed resolution status, displaying the terminated agreement record with full audit validation and irreversible timestamping. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his posture no longer projecting authority, but instead reflecting the absence of it, as he processed the collapse of a $900 million structure that had ended not through negotiation failure, but through recognition failure. Jason Whitmore stared at the table's surface, no longer attempting to speak, as if language itself had temporarily lost relevance in a space where outcomes were no longer influenced by opinion. Elizabeth Whitmore looked toward Victoria Carter with an expression that no longer contained negotiation intent, only the quiet realization that assumption had been the foundation of every miscalculation that brought them here. Maya Collins observed the final system confirmation populate across multiple governance layers, each one marking the agreement as formally closed under executive directive authority, with all prior engagement history preserved as audit evidence of procedural completion. Daniel finally spoke in a low and formal tone, confirming that the transaction had been fully terminated, all associated financial pathways had been deactivated, and Whitmore Capital no longer retained active execution rights within the agreement structure. The words were procedural, but their meaning extended beyond process, because they confirmed permanence. Richard finally broke the silence, asking quietly if there was any scenario under which the agreement could be revisited, and Daniel responded with measured clarity that only a new executive initiation could reopen a closed directive state, and that no such initiation currently existed. Jason exhaled slowly, looking briefly toward Victoria, but not with challenge, only with the realization that the dynamic he had assumed was competitive had never actually been competitive at all. Elizabeth lowered her gaze, her earlier composure now replaced with the understanding that presence in the room had not equaled influence over it. Maya noted the final system status update, which confirmed full archival of the event into institutional compliance records, ensuring that every decision, every delay, and every authorization shift was permanently logged under executive governance review. Victoria Carter remained seated for a moment longer, her presence unchanged, not as a reaction to what had occurred, but as confirmation that what had occurred was the intended outcome of a process that others had misunderstood from the beginning. She then closed her portfolio with quiet finality, a gesture that signaled not the end of a conversation, but the completion of a structure that had never required validation from those who were merely observing it. Daniel stepped slightly back from the table, acknowledging the closure state, while the system interface faded from active display into permanent record mode. Richard Whitmore finally looked down, no longer at documents or screens, but at the empty space where expectation had once existed. Jason remained silent, understanding now that the scale of $900 million had never been the defining factor, but rather the authority behind its final decision. Elizabeth did not move, as if still processing the absence of any remaining procedural leverage. Maya Collins closed her system view, her expression calm but changed, as though she had just witnessed the precise moment when assumption became irreversible error. Victoria Carter finally stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet control she had carried since entering the room, and as she did, the entire sequence of negotiation, resistance, and resolution settled into its final state. No one stopped her, not because they lacked the ability, but because they finally understood that nothing about the moment required permission anymore.